Hey everybody, it's Friday, and this is basically what class is going to be like as long as we're doing the remote learning. The way that things have gone this week is pretty much standard for what we're going to be doing day to day. There'll be several days a week where I'll just say you need to look at the notes, this slide to this slide. It might be something where I say, uh, you know, here's a link to a music video or a couple of music videos. I want you to check these out. I might give you a writing prompt like watch this video or watch these two videos or listen to these songs, compare them, something like that. I won't do that all the time, but I might do that every once in a while just to change things up a little bit. Uh, Expect, as long as we're doing this, as long as we're at home, expect something like what we did with the quiz where we had a couple of days where I told you to look at the notes, read over the notes this day, read over these notes the next day, and then give a quiz, just if you want to call it a quiz, whatever. Most of the quizzes we have when we're in class will involve the music that we're listening to. That's another thing. Since you all are at home, I can't give you CDs for each chapter like I usually do. So I have created a playlist on YouTube, and I linked the playlist, I believe, yesterday for the chapter 1 music, and that has every one of the songs that would have been on the CD that I would give you if we had been sitting in class together. But what I'll do on Fridays is I will record a video of me talking through the notes, so it's not just you looking at a couple of slides and that's it. Because some of the stuff, especially with the performers we're going to be talking about, there's going to be some stories that I have to tell. There are some things maybe that just need a little more explanation, but also some neat, funny, sometimes disgusting stories that I have to tell, just because my brain is like a sponge when it comes to trivia type stuff. And when you're talking about rock and roll and just professional musicians in general, a lot of times they get into some stuff that make for some pretty good stories. But let me go ahead and start presenting here so you can see the notes. And if you've had any trouble up until this point, all you need to do is do what I'm doing here in terms of accessing the material. Anytime I post something, like right here where I posted a new assignment, quiz, chapter 1, slides 1 through 7. Well, you click on that and that shows me something different than what you all see. But if you click on classwork here and see, there's your playlist that's getting ready to drop on Thursday. But here in chapter 1 resources, it's got your PowerPoint notes, it's got your playlist. This is what I made up the YouTube playlist with the music about. It tells you the name of the song and it tells you the artist that performed that song. If we were in school, I would be giving music quizzes, and I would split it up, and I put 5 or 6 songs on each each CD, or each quiz, I'm sorry, off of the 5 or 6 songs off of the CD on each quiz. I would play like 30 seconds to a minute of her song, and you'd have to tell me that the song I just played was Crossroad Blues by Robert Johnson. Or maybe you remember Crossroad Blues, but you can't remember the artist's name. Well, then you get half credit on that one. Or vice versa. Maybe you can't remember the name of the song, but you could tell by that voice, that's a Robert Johnson. You get half credit that way. But we do those throughout the chapter as we move along. I mix it up. I don't go straight down the list, but I mix it up. So that way, you get, we listen to it in class, talk about it a little bit. Sometimes we'll listen to some songs while we're talking about that specific artist. It just depends. Went ahead and put the study guide up that I usually use for the chapter test. Maybe not in all my classes, but in history of rock and roll, if you know what's on the study guide come test time, I'm not going to say you'll ace it and make 100, but if you know what's on the study guide and you've listened to your music, then you should be just fine on the test. Now, let's get into the notes for today. That's all you have to do right there is just click on that and it will pull the notes up like this. What I'm going to do, just because this is kind of small print, is I am going to switch over to my PowerPoint and I will go into the presentation from there. So what we're talking about right now is chapter 1 in my history of rock and roll class is primarily about the blues, but it is more than anything about the roots of rock and roll, where rock and roll came from. I would say that blues is the biggest part of rock and roll, the influences of rock and roll, but country played a role. Gospel, believe it or not, played a role. In a lot of cases, even if you don't hear gospel influence in rock and roll, I mean, the argument could be made that rock and roll came about kind of as the antithesis or going in the opposite direction of gospel or spiritual type music. Because as y'all know, rock and roll is supposed to be evil. That's another thing. If you don't know me, as we get to know each other a little better, sometimes I break out into, weird voices, impersonations, things like that. It has much better effect whenever you're in class with me as opposed to looking at a PowerPoint slide here. But the roots of rock and roll, we'll look at, pop music that was popular, in the years leading up. Not a lot. The big focus in this chapter is going to be blues because, again, that is where the biggest influence came from. Now, this first slide here, again, is just some basic information about where rock came from, going a little farther back than blues music of the 20s, 30s, 40s, going up into the 50s. Rock and roll was born supposedly in 1954. That's when Elvis started recording. But, like I say here in the notes, blues originated as a mixture of the musical style of the various African slaves. Of course, all African slaves didn't come from the same place in Africa. So each region that they came from, they each had their own unique musical style. You also have to take into account, you look at what was going on, not just in the southern states in the U.S., but all throughout. I mean, slavery was most heavily used in the South, but for the longest time throughout the colonies, slavery was legal in even northern colonies. But as time goes on, you start to see, because it wasn't as prevalent in the northern colonies, and in colonies in later states where slavery wasn't heavily used, those are going to be the first states that make slavery illegal at a state level, not at a national level. Of course, that's going to be decided by the Civil War. But in the South, because of plantation farming and the need for massive amounts of manual labor, that's why slavery thrived as an institution in the South. And again, you're bringing in African slaves from all different parts of Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa. And you also have, now granted, most of the white colonists that lived in those southern states were English. I mean, you had English, you had Scottish, you had Welsh, you had Irish. You get closer to the Mississippi River, and you're talking about Louisiana, and you have French settlers there. You get into Florida, and even before they really take shape as true colonies or later states, the southern part of Georgia, the eastern part of Alabama, the Spanish had spread out. It's not just like they came to a line drawn on the ground and said, oh, we got to stop here. So you had various European, and you also had German immigrants. You had Dutch coming in. Now, they might tend to be farther north, but they might also be in the southern states. So you had this huge mixture of all these different European backgrounds, all of these different African backgrounds, and they all had their own artistic and musical styles. And as they mix together, it creates specifically blues and gospel as time goes on. One way that you see African music differing from traditional European music, I mean, going back into the Middle Ages, traditional European music would have been the Gregorian chant as it was used in masses in the Catholic Church. A lot of African cultures placed more emphasis on rhythm as opposed to vocal harmony. And as we listen to, I don't know what you all think of it yet if you've listened to the playlist, but people like Robert Johnson, people like Blind Lemon Jefferson, that Black Snake Moan is probably my least favorite song that will be on a CD or will get talked about the entire year. But it's very important because, when I talk about Blind Lemon Jefferson here in a few minutes, you'll see, he had an impact. I just don't personally like the song. It doesn't mean it's a bad song. I just don't like it. But if you listen to the blues, you see right there that emphasis on rhythm as opposed to harmony, or even just if there's only one person performing, having a beautiful singing voice. That wasn't necessarily important to the blues. Actually, it kind of takes away from it if they're too good. It doesn't feel as gritty, I guess you would say, if they have too good of a singing voice. But the focus on rhythm over harmony, that definitely comes out, especially in Delta blues music. Now, as we start getting into more urban, electrified blues, then the compositions start to be, I guess, what would you say, more slick, and harmony becomes more of an emphasis. But Delta blues especially has deep roots, into African cultures and the emphasis that they placed on music. Also, where the blues came from was, and I think I touch on this in the very next bullet here, that Southern or Delta blues has its roots specifically in slavery. And, there's no other way to look at it. Slavery was horrible. And because of, how horrible their lives tended to be, day after day after day, toiling out in the fields, they didn't have a whole lot to be cheerful about. If your life is, pardon my French, crap, you're not going to be singing, happy songs about rainbows and sunshine all the time. You're going to be talking, you're going to be singing about more depressing things because those are the feelings you have. Think about it. Now, it could go either way, but a lot of times, think about the music you listen to when you're in a certain mood. If you're angry, you probably listen to more aggressive, angry sounding music. You might try to listen to other types of music, to calm you down or whatever the case is. But generally, people tend to listen to music based off of emotional, how their emotional feelings are at the time. Well, the blues comes about because, the African American population in the South, even after slavery, after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, they didn't really have these former slaves didn't really have a whole lot to be happy about. Their lives were extremely difficult. Now, as you really start to see the blues hit its stride as a major genre or type of music, as we get into the 1920s and the 1930s. Now, still, because of the Jim Crow South, African Americans, more often than not, it didn't matter how talented they were. It didn't matter what they were capable of. They're not going to get a shot, a major recording contract or things like that. If an African American performer, male or female, got a recording contract, it was akin to a miracle. And even then, it's probably going to be a small time studio recording somebody very cheap, getting a small number of records released. Not much different than, a blues musician making a name for themselves might not be much different than a SoundCloud rapper today. Somebody that's producing music, in a back room or in a basement, maybe not necessarily have top of the line equipment. And that's not to say that people doing stuff on SoundCloud can't have high production value, but they just can't produce the same quality when you've got multi-million-dollar artists that are backed by major labels that are pouring millions of dollars into the production of an album because of how much they expect that album to make. Every once in a while, before the birth of rock and roll, you would see some blues musicians, but they were few and far between that really made a name for themselves. Robert Johnson, he is considered the godfather of rock and roll because it really all started with him. You might listen to his music and not think that his guitar playing is all that spectacular, but compared to what people were doing in 1935, 36, 37, and all the way up until the time he died in 1938, he was doing things with guitars that nobody at that point had ever thought of. And because now, whether he told the story himself or it's like people started talking about, oh, have you ever heard Robert Johnson? Have you heard what he can make? He can make that guitar sing. Well, what I heard is that, superstition also played a lot into blues. The devil is a very popular theme. That's one of the reasons why the blues was evil. Before rock and roll was the devil's music, the blues were. And because the blues were the opposite of gospel, instead of being about God, instead of being about, praising Jesus, the blues before rock and roll was about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Robert Johnson, during his time, he was probably, without a recording contract, he was probably one of the best known blues musicians throughout the South. And really what it was is you just had to catch him because, he didn't have Twitter. He didn't have a fan club. He didn't have a promoter. He didn't have a manager. He just traveled from town to town. He'd stay in one town for a few nights, play shows. He'd get a cut of whatever the bar or the club made. And after he wore out his welcome, he'd travel on to the next town, and he just kept moving in a circuit through the South. They did tell a story that supposedly when he first started playing the guitar, he wasn't any good. And, he wanted to be a musician. He wanted to be famous for his music. So supposedly he cut a deal with the devil. Supposedly he met the devil at the crossroads, which was a common superstition that on the night of a full moon, or maybe it was on a new moon, you go to a crossroads at midnight and the devil would appear and you could work out a barter for whatever your heart desired. Well, he wanted to learn to play the guitar. So the devil ended up giving him a special guitar. I mean, you see stuff like this also popping up in things like The Devil Went Down to Georgia by Charlie Daniels Band. If you've ever watched Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? The guy that they pick up at the crossroads as they're fleeing at one point in the movie. There's a guy standing at a crossroads that morning as they're speeding down this back road. They stop and pick him up. And he says his name's Tommy instead of Robert, but his name is Tommy Johnson. And he tells a little story about how, he met the devil and sold his soul at the crossroads the night before to learn how to play the guitar better than anybody's ever done before. Now, like I said, he was only recorded one time that we know of. Very few actual recording sessions of Robert Johnson. His complete catalog, his entire discography, 29 total songs. To be as famous as he is as a musician, he only recorded a total of 29 songs, and they were recorded by traveling members of the Library of Congress. They were going around through the South and they were trying to get samplings of regional music, whether it was from blues musicians, gospel singers. They went into the Appalachian Mountains, up into the hills. They found some hillbillies and, they recorded copies of bluegrass music being played, because there were all of these small musicians that maybe they weren't even professional musicians, but they were out in the corners of the less populated states in the South. And the Library of Congress, they were looking to preserve, you know, this art that was out in more rural locations. In terms of how he died, I think they recorded those 29 songs while they interviewed him over the course of 2 days, and it was a mobile recording studio. That's why the recordings sound really scratchy, is because it was the equivalent of a tape recorder that was big enough to fit in the trunk of a car, which, that's huge, but still, it wasn't the same quality of recording material that they would have in an actual professional studio. We have no proof about how Robert Johnson died, but three legends, they all have similar aspects. He was poisoned in each one, and there was a woman involved in each one. Now, in one version of the story, he came into a town that he would pass through every so often and play at this one club. Well, there's one version of the story where he was having an affair with the club owner's wife, or club owner's wife, and the club owner found out and poisoned the bottle of whiskey that he had given Johnson to take up on stage with him. There's another version of the story that says that the club owner's wife found out Robert Johnson was having an affair with another woman in town, and the club owner's wife poisoned him. Then there's a third version that says that this other woman may have been the one that poisoned him. All we know is that he was 27 years old and he was poisoned and died as a result, but he was heavily intoxicated the night of his death. The two songs that I placed on your CD or on the playlist for you all to listen to are Crossroad Blues, which is probably his most famous, and I Believe I'll Dust My Broom. Now, I think I skipped somebody. No, I didn't. Now, when you really start to see the blues come out of the South, it's going to be in the 1920s. It's going to be during the Roaring '20s, after World War I, where because of World War I and so many white men were drafted and sent off to fight in Europe during the last year of World War I, that created a need for labor. So what you start to see are African Americans moving out of farms, plantations on the South, being sharecroppers. They start moving north. They move to places like Memphis. They move to St. Louis. They move to Chicago. They move to Detroit. They start working in factories. You're going to see this happen during World War II as well, when things are even more mechanized. But they start moving north because there's a need for manual labor that isn't on farms. Well, you get a job, even though African Americans might not have been paid as much as whites were, you're going to get paid better working in a factory than you are working on a plantation, working as a sharecropper. So you see a lot of people end up moving to more urban areas, trying to get jobs in cities after World War I, like I said again, after World War II. And because people are making more money, they're looking to spend more money. There was more of a nightlife. It's just like here in Breckenridge County. There's really nothing to do around here. But if you lived in Louisville, there's stuff to do all time of day, all times of the night, in a larger city. It was the same way. You go to Chicago, people are making more money and there's stuff to do. People are looking to blow off steam after a long day of work. There are bigger clubs, there's bars, there are clubs in the South, but there are bigger clubs, there are bigger bars. There's more of them in a major city. So there's more opportunity for musicians to perform. Big Bill Broomsey, the song of his that's on the CD or the playlist, Keys to the Highway, that's I really enjoy that song. It's one of my personal favorites on the CD. But Big Bill Broonzy, he was born in 1898. He was the son of slaves. Uh, He wasn't necessarily the youngest, but he was towards the end, I believe, of 16 brothers and sisters. So he had uh, 16 total kids, 15 brothers and sisters for him. Uh, at the age of 9, supposedly, he made his first musical instrument. Of course, his parents being former slaves, sharecroppers, they didn't have any money. So he made his first instrument, a fiddle out of a cigar box and some baling twine. Uh, and what he would do is, he would entertain, the local families that lived in that area of the plantation as sharecroppers. As they would get together at nights, it's always, kind of like at a family get together. If, one of the little kids says something funny, and some of the adults, one of the adults gets everybody else's attention, say, tell that joke again, tell that joke again. Everybody just enjoys seeing a little kid perform. Well, he ends up showing that he's got quite a bit of musical skill. Now, the sad thing about Big Bill Broonzy is he died in 1958. He was a recording musician for 34 years. He got his first recording contract in 1924 after he moved to Chicago. He always had to have another job to pay the bills, whether it was before he moved working as a plowhand, a preacher, working on the railroad, as a waiter, as a piano mover. He served in the Army during World War I. After World War I's over, he moves to Chicago. He becomes a recording musician, but music never paid the bills. It was just something he always did on the side. It wasn't until 1951 that he finally, at the age of 53, he finally ends up getting a big break. He got a job. This is right before rock and roll takes off, but the blues were really big in Europe. American blues were really popular. So he ends up getting a gig on this tour of Europe in 1951. And whether he was in England, whether he was in France, whether he was in Germany, they loved his music, and his records finally started selling at a level that he could finally live off of his music. Unfortunately, he ended up contracting throat cancer, I believe in 1954, and battled with it for the last 4 years. So, he didn't get to live a truly comfortable life off of his music until the last 7 years of his life, and a lot of those last few years were dealt struggling, fighting cancer. So, like I said, give Key to the Highway a shot. I think it's a pretty good song. You might enjoy it as well. Now, this slide you might just look over on your own. I've already touched on it on one of the quizzes that Delta blues was acoustic. It tended to be more gloomy, more depressing, whereas Chicago, as more people started moving to Memphis, St. Louis, Chicago, you have the birth of urban blues because wired buildings are more common, electricity is more common in cities. You start having people plug their guitars into amplifiers. You start to have, it really changes the music, because now you could have a crowded bar, people talking, glasses clinking together, people shouting, laughing. You can plug that guitar into an amplifier. You can plug the microphone into an amplifier, and they're still going to hear your music. It's going to catch people's attention. And if you've got skill, people are going to start coming to that club. If the club notices that more people are coming in on the night that you're playing, you're going to have a fairly consistent job, or they're at least going to keep bringing you back in every so often. And also, if there's more people that are around to hear you play, there's a better chance that you get a recording contract. And where are the recording studios? In the big cities, not out in the middle of the country. Because there were more opportunities in the urban areas, urban blues, in addition to being electrified as opposed to acoustic, they tend to be more upbeat songs, more optimistic. These are people that had fled the oppression of the South. Even though slavery had ended, there was still a great deal of oppression in those southern states. They escaped the South. And that's not to say there wasn't racism in the North. There most definitely was, but they didn't have to deal with the same sort of things. It wasn't as bad. It was still there. It was still racism, but it wasn't as bad as it was in the Deep South. Blind Lemon Jefferson, like I said, he doesn't have the most pleasing blues voice, but he also had a very successful career as a gospel musician. And this is one of those things, he had to have a pseudonym. He had to have an alternate name. He was born blind, and yes, his parents did name him Lemon. So since he was blind and his name was Lemon, it wasn't a blues nickname. He was Lemon Jefferson, and he was born blind, so he was called Blind Lemon Jefferson. He worked his way around Texas as a teenager, playing music where he could. Lived as a hobo for a little while in his mid to late teens. Excuse me. At the age of 25, and again, this is very, very out of the ordinary. 1925, Jefferson ends up signing a record deal with Paramount Records, which was a national label, not a little local record label. Paramount signed him to a record deal, and what they came to figure out is he had, because he grew up in a religious household, he sang gospel. But from his travels, he also started to play the blues. Well, found out that he had a following in both areas, and the religious community and people that would listen to gospel music didn't listen to blues music. So what he would do is he would record his blues albums under the name Blind Lemon Jefferson. He would record his gospel songs under the name Deacon L.J. Bates, L.J. Lemon Jefferson. Bates, I can't remember where that came from. That might have been like his mother's maiden name or something along those lines. Anything that was performed by an African American at this point in history in the 1920s were referred to as race records. He was the best-selling African American artist from 1925 until his death in 1930. In one of his songs, he coined the term booger rooger, which meant a wild party. As time goes on through the 40s on into the 50s, it becomes a term that Little Richard, that we'll talk about in chapter 2, used quite a bit, boogie woogie. Boogie woogie is essentially the type of music that evolved out of blues and wasn't quite yet rock and roll. Rock and roll was very closely related to boogie woogie. Blind Lemon Jefferson, he influenced a lot of blues musicians that would come along through the 40s and 50s. Lightning Hopkins, we'll talk about T-Bone Walker here in a little bit. B.B. King, even though he was maybe older than Jefferson, his career started later. Muddy Waters. They were all influenced by Jefferson because Jefferson was that breakout artist that was recording on a national major label before anybody else was. And again, Black Snake Moan, his most famous blues song, I'm not a huge fan, but you have to listen to it just to get the experience. It's a constant source of humor for my students every year when we hit Blind Lemon Jefferson. I'm going to stop right there for T-Bone Walker. We will pick back up with this later. I don't know. I might make another video in the middle of the week and post it as opposed to waiting until next week. We'll just have to see how that goes. What I have to do here is pull Meet back up. And I know this has been a long one, and I actually covered a few days worth of material here. But like I said, you won't have to worry about downloading this. I'll post it on YouTube, and you can just listen to it, watch it whenever you feel the need to. All right, I will talk to you all later.